His hand closes around the scroll before he even looks at who handed it to him. It is early. The room is already crowded. Senators, clients, men who want something from him, the way men always want something from him now. Someone presses a folded piece of papyrus into his fingers, urgent, insistent, trying to catch his eye. He doesn't stop walking. He doesn't unroll it. There are 100 scrolls like this one every week. Petitions, flattery, warnings that turn out to be nothing. He tucks it into the fold of his toga and moves on, because a man who has conquered as much of the world as he has learns, eventually, not to flinch at every whispered urgency. He is 55 years old. He has crossed a river he was forbidden to cross and made himself master of Rome. He has been declared dictator for life, dictator perpetuo, a title no Roman before him had dared to hold or survive holding. He has outlasted enemies, outmaneuvered rivals, forgiven men who plotted against him, and pardoned them again when they plotted a second time. What he does not know, walking into the Senate House that morning with an unread scroll folded against his chest, is that the men waiting for him inside are not there to petition him. They are there to end him. Good morning and welcome. Today we're going back to the 15th of March, 44 BC, the last morning of Julius Caesar's life, to understand something that sounds almost impossible. How a man who had spent decades winning nearly everyone over ended up surrounded in a room full of people he trusted by more than 60 men who wanted him dead. If you enjoy stories like this, history told slowly the way it deserves, consider following along with HistoLingo. Because the truth is, almost no one starts out wanting Julius Caesar dead. That hatred had to be built, one decision at a time, over 30 years, and by the end, it wasn't just his enemies who wanted him gone, it was his friends. Caesar was never supposed to be the most powerful man in Rome. He came from an old patrician family, the Julii, who claimed descent from the goddess Venus herself, a claim that meant more for pride than for money. By the time Caesar was a young man, his family had prestige but little real wealth or influence. He built his career the way ambitious Romans without deep pockets often did, through debt, through daring, through a willingness to gamble everything on the next office, the next campaign, the next audience with the crowd. He was, from the start, a man who understood something most of the Roman elite didn't. Rome's old aristocracy believed power came from bloodline and Senate approval. Caesar believed power came from the people, the soldiers who followed him, the crowds who cheered him, the ordinary Romans who had never once been invited to a senator's dinner table, but who could, if properly courted, decide an election or a war. That instinct made him popular. It also made him dangerous. For years, the Senate watched him rise with a kind of wary tolerance. He held office after office, each one a rung higher, each one bringing him closer to real power. Then, in 60 BC, he did something that changed everything. He formed a secret political alliance with two of the most powerful men in Rome, Pompey, the celebrated general, and Crassus, the wealthiest man in the Republic. Historians would later call it the First Triumvirate. It wasn't official, it wasn't legal exactly. It was three ambitious men agreeing quietly to stop competing with each other and start ruling together instead. With that alliance behind him, Caesar was given command of Gaul, modern-day France, and beyond. And for nearly a decade, he did something no one in Rome had fully anticipated. He won. Again and again and again. He conquered tribes the Romans had feared for generations. He crossed into Britain, a place so remote that most Romans considered it half legend. He wrote his own account of the campaigns, the commentaries, and sent them home, not as private reports, but as public dispatches read aloud in the forum, turning his distant wars into a serialized story that made him a household name. By the time the Gallic Wars ended, Caesar wasn't just a general. He was the most famous man in the Roman world. He commanded the loyalty of battle-hardened legions who had followed him through a decade of hardship. He had wealth beyond what even the Senate could easily control. And, back in Rome, men who had once dismissed him as a clever but minor politician now watched him with something closer to fear. Pompey, his old ally, began to wonder whether the arrangement that had made them both powerful had quietly made one of them too powerful. Crassus was dead by now, killed in a disastrous campaign in the East. The triumvirate that once balanced three ambitions had collapsed into a rivalry between two men, and Rome, watching nervously, understood that only one of them would come out of it still standing. In January of 49 BC, the Senate, pushed hard by Pompey and Caesar's other rivals, ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. It was, on paper, a legal command. In practice, it was a trap. Without his legions, Caesar would have no protection from the political enemies who had spent years waiting to prosecute him, ruin him, or worse. The moment he was no longer untouchable, he had a choice almost no Roman before him had faced so starkly: obey and risk everything he'd built, or refuse and become an enemy of the state. He chose neither and both. At a small river in northern Italy called the Rubicon, the legal boundary beyond which no general could bring an army without becoming an invader of Rome itself, Caesar paused. Ancient sources say he hesitated on the bank, weighing what came next. Then he led his soldiers across. Alia iacta est, he is said to have remarked. The die is cast. It was, in every sense that mattered, a declaration of civil war. And the Rome that Caesar marched toward was no longer a city that could welcome him back as simply a victorious general. He had crossed from ambition into rebellion, and there was no marching back across that river uncrossed. The war that followed lasted years and stretched across the Mediterranean. Italy, Greece, Egypt, North Africa, Spain. Pompey fled and was eventually murdered in Egypt on the orders of advisors to a young pharaoh hoping to win Caesar's favor. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria and was presented with his old rival's severed head, witnesses say he wept, whether from grief, from the loss of the man he'd once called friend and son-in-law, or from the realization of what it meant to be now entirely without equal. By 45 BC, the fighting was largely over. Caesar had won. He returned to Rome not as one power among several, but as the single most dominant figure the Republic had ever produced. And that, more than any battle, is where his real danger began. Rome had used the office of dictator before. A temporary emergency position granted for 6 months at a time, meant to hand one man total authority only long enough to steer the state through a crisis, then relinquish it. Caesar did not relinquish it. He was made dictator again, and again, each term longer than the last, until in February of 44 BC, barely a month before his death, the Senate granted him the title Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life. Not an emergency measure anymore, a permanent one. To many Romans, especially the common people, this looked less like tyranny than relief. Caesar used his power to pass reforms that mattered to ordinary lives, resettling veterans and the poor on new land, expanding citizenship, reforming the calendar itself into something close to the one we still use today, launching public building projects that put people to work. He was, by many measures, a genuinely popular and even generous ruler. But to the old aristocratic families who had run Rome for centuries, none of that mattered as much as one plain fact: the Republic The system of shared power, annual elections, and Senate authority that Rome had prided itself on for nearly 500 years now had in practice a king in everything but name, and Romans hated the word king. Their entire political identity had been built on having thrown one out centuries earlier and swearing never to let one rule again. Statues of Caesar began appearing beside statues of Rome's ancient gods. Coins were struck bearing his living face, something no Roman had ever done for a man still breathing. There were whispers never confirmed that he might accept the title of king outright. At a public festival, a crowd offered him a diadem, a symbol of monarchy. He refused it publicly to visible relief from the watching crowd. But refusing it once wasn't enough to undo what the offer itself had revealed. Someone had felt it worth trying, and once that question had been asked out loud, would he take the crown? Cax id nu, it could not be unasked. Here is the detail that made Caesar's death different from almost every political killing that came before it in Rome. It wasn't ordered by an enemy from outside his circle. It was carried out by men from inside it. More than 60 senators were eventually connected to the conspiracy. Many of them were men Caesar had personally pardoned after they'd fought against him in the Civil War. Men he had promoted. Men he had trusted with office, with friendship, with his own safety. Gaius Cassius Longinus was among the conspiracy's sharpest organizers, a skilled general with old grievances and a genuine belief that Caesar's rule had strangled the republic he loved. But it was another name that would echo down the centuries: Marcus Junius Brutus. Brutus's family carried a particular weight in Roman memory. Generations earlier, an ancestor of his had helped drive out Rome's last king and found the republic itself. To many conspirators, having a Brutus join them wasn't just useful. It was symbolic. It suggested that killing Caesar wasn't murder, but a restoration, history correcting itself through the bloodline that had corrected it once before. And Caesar loved Brutus. Some ancient writers even suggested, without certainty, that Caesar may have believed Brutus was his own son, born of a long affair with Brutus's mother, Servilia. Whether or not that was true, Caesar had shown Brutus favor for years. Forgiveness after the war, promotion, trust. That is what made Brutus's presence in the conspiracy so devastating and so useful to the men recruiting him. If even Brutus believed Caesar had to die for Rome to survive, then perhaps the conspirators reasoned the killing wouldn't look like ambition or grudge. It would look like principle. They set the date for the Ides of March, the 15th, when Caesar was due to attend a Senate meeting at the Theater of Pompey, ironically, a building his old rival had built. In the days before, warnings began arriving. A seer is said to have told Caesar to beware the Ides of March. His wife Calpurnia reportedly dreamed of him dying in her arms and begged him not to go. And that morning, as he made his way toward the Senate, a man in the crowd pressed a scroll into his hand, one that, ancient sources say, laid out the entire plot in writing, names included. Caesar folded it, unread, into the pile of papers already in his grip. He entered the Senate meeting, still holding papers he hadn't read. The conspirators had planned carefully. One of them, Tullius Cimber, approached first, under the pretext of pleading for his exiled brother's return. When Caesar waved him off, Cimber grabbed at his toga, the signal. The others closed in. The first blow came from behind. A stab to the neck or shoulder, accounts vary. Caesar reportedly cried out and tried to fight back, stabbing one attacker with a stylus, the only weapon he had, but there were too many of them. and they had planned for exactly this. Man after man stepped forward to strike, some historians say almost ritualistically, so that no single conspirator could be singled out as the killer, so that the blood and the responsibility would be shared among all of them equally. He was stabbed 23 times. Ancient sources disagree on his final words. The famous line, "Et tu, Brute," "You too, Brutus," comes not from any eyewitness, but from Shakespeare, 16 centuries later. What the historian Suetonius records is different, and in some ways sadder, that when Caesar saw Brutus approaching with the others, he simply stopped fighting, pulled his toga over his face, and let it happen. Whether or not he spoke those exact words, the sentiment behind them is almost certainly true. Of everyone in that room, Brutus was the betrayal that mattered. Caesar fell at the base of a statue of Pompey, the rival he had once wept over in Egypt, whose war he had won, whose city he now bled across the floor of. The men who had built one of the largest empires the world had ever seen dispersed into the streets of Rome, some of them still holding bloodied blades, expecting the people to cheer. The people did not cheer. They ran. The conspirators had believed sincerely in many cases that killing Caesar would restore the Republic, that Rome, freed of one man's outsized power, would return to shared governance among the Senate's elite. Instead, they triggered exactly what they feared most. Caesar's death didn't end the concentration of power in Rome. It created a vacuum that plunged the Republic into over a decade more of civil war, out of which emerged not a restored Senate, but Caesar's own adopted heir, a young man named Octavian, who would eventually become Rome's first emperor, Augustus. The republic the conspirators died trying to save didn't survive them by more than a generation. Brutus and Cassius fled Rome, raised armies, and were eventually defeated. Both took their own lives rather than be captured. Most of the other conspirators met similarly violent ends within a few years, hunted down one by one in what Romans came to call, without much sentiment, simply the proscriptions. Caesar dead became more powerful in some ways than Caesar alive. He was formally deified by the Roman state, the first Roman to be officially worshipped as a god. The month of his birth, Quintilis, was renamed Julius in his honor. We still call it July. That scroll, the one pressed into Caesar's hand on his way into the Senate that final morning, the one he folded, unread, into his other papers, was found on his body afterward, still sealed. He never knew what it said. Historians widely believe it named the conspirators outright, that the single piece of paper capable of saving his life sat against his chest, unread, for the length of a walk he never finished. It is tempting, looking back across 2,000 years, to see that scroll as a strange historical footnote. It isn't. It's the whole story, folded small enough to carry in one hand. Caesar had survived war, exile, betrayal, and the crossing of a river that could have ended him a dozen different ways. What he could not survive was the ordinary human instinct to believe that today would be like every other day, that the men closest to him were still the men he thought he knew, that there would always be time later to read the warning. Most of us will never cross a river like the Rubicon or face 60 men closing in with knives. But most of us know, in some smaller and quieter way, what it is to fold a warning unread into the pile of things we'll get to later. A conversation we keep putting off, a feeling we talk ourselves out of, a person who has changed in ways we haven't let ourselves see. He conquered nearly the entire known world. In the end, it wasn't an army that undid him. It was a piece of paper he never opened. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing to HistoLingo. There are more like it waiting.